First of all, Councilmember Taylor has an announcement.
If you guys remember last week, I talked about the invite that came from the CDOT commissioners for a luncheon in Castle Rock, and couldn't figure out why they were meeting in Colorado Springs in the morning and then inviting for a lunch in Castle Rock. Well, I followed up on that, and they actually start with a breakfast and their quarterly meeting in Colorado Springs, and then they adjourn at noon, and so the luncheon begins at 1 in Castle Rock. I am planning to go. If anybody else wants to go, I'll give you the information. Just let me know after the meeting tonight, and I'll get it to you.
The date again, Jim?
February 3rd. No, excuse me, February 16th. February 16th.
Okay, before we get started, for the record, all of council are present except for Councilmember Cernanek. And I'll turn it over to City Manager Penny.
Thank you, Mayor. So we have on the agenda this evening the HPB discussion, code discussion, which was in the council packet and distributed via memo to you. We also had other code discussion, and we're actually proposing that we not talk about other codes this evening. And let me explain a little bit what our thought process has been and where we're coming at from this. So we were, as you're aware, we were waiting to hear the council goals and objectives and have you adopt those. Throughout that discussion, as well as just more offline, both internally, meaning staff initiated, as well as individual council members, we've been compiling a laundry list of code amendments that are both very specific, changing sewer billing, fees, et cetera, as an example, to very grandiose in terms of looking at the subdivision code as an example, or HPB. And we were hoping to have a little bit more substance to some of the low-hanging fruit components for this evening's discussion. But I think if we start to drill down in there, it'll become a little disjointed. And what we'd propose is that we just talk about HPB. I think we've got a meaty enough discussion in that realm. And then we will come back to you both, or either, I guess I would say, in a study session for those things that we think will warrant some healthy non-first reading council discussion, or if we think that they're relatively non-controversial, we'll bring them as a first reading item directly to you and make the staff presentation as part of that first reading. So we do have a method to our madness, and we're working on it. We're just timing of the meetings and when we're actually prepared to discuss aren't working all that well. So if you have additional items, or if you had some things that you wanted to bring forward on item B tonight, I'd ask that you just email them to me, and we will throw them into the hopper as well, and we'll add them to the list, because we definitely have a list. I would say in totality we're going to be starting at Chapter 1 and working our way through the book at some level. So we have a Department of Health and Human Services, I learned the other day when I looked at Chapter 1. So, but you guys didn't know that as an example. So, and a lot of this, as you well know from your goals and objectives, will be in the land use and zoning arena of the world. So
Just don't let the county know that.
yeah, no. Yes, if there's any commissioners watching. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our Community Development Director, and he will walk you through tonight's presentation and discussion.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm sure this will be a scintillating discussion, and I did want to point out that this is really, Kirsten has put a lot of work into this, working with our staff, Andrea Minna, who's to my left here, and then we also have our Vice Chair of Historic Preservation, Chuck Reed, here as well. So with that, I guess just a real quick history, and I'm sure you all know the history, but it's helpful for me that realizing back in 2005 is when the council created the Main Street Historic District. I think it was a booming success, and then you had a lot of property owners who originally did want to be a part of becoming part of the action, and they wanted a way into the Main Street Historic District. So in 2006, the process was amended to allow people to opt into the Main Street Historic District. And so now we realize that we were in such a hurry to allow people to opt in, we really didn't set a process in place of how somebody could be added to the district and what kind of criteria the council would use to decide whether a property is added to the Main Street District or is not. Also a part of that discussion is how do we define contributing and non-contributing structures to the Main Street District? We actually define contributing, so I guess you could think, well, what's the opposite of that? Must be non-contributing. But Kirsten feels that we should define non-contributing as well in a little bit more detail. So what we presented to the Historic Preservation Commission was an idea that we really ought to amend the code to create a new process to allow people to opt in, and that would include developing an application, setting criteria. There would first be a hearing and a recommendation from the Historical Preservation Board, and then ultimately it would come to council for final approval. And then on top of that, it's the Historic Preservation Board and the staff's feeling that once we get an idea, and is everyone clear as far as what the district is today and what the opt-in district is? It's in our downtown neighborhood plan of the properties that are actually in the district now. The opt-in area is any property that touches Main Street that is not a part of the district, except for the 2300 block, which I think are the Main Street apartments. That area is specifically excluded. So if a property, if we get to a point where everything within the opt-in area reaches 66% of the property owners, and Kirsten has kind of laid out that a property is individual property, so you could have a property owner that owns 3 properties, and that would count as 3 different votes. That once we get to that point of a 66%, a tipping point will kick in and everybody comes into the district. So that you could call a non-consensual decree, that those properties that maybe are on Main Street, all the neighbors have come into a point where we're over that 66%. It's the board and staff's feeling that it ought to come in to the district. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that you have a number of owners that have invested the time and effort to bring up their properties and be subject to additional review by historic preservation. So they're giving up a little bit of their rights in order to have a nice appearance to Main Street and make Main Street what it is today. So they have a certain amount of rights too, and I guess the issue gets to a point where now if I've done that, if I've taken the effort to upgrade my building and go through HPB and go through the rigorous review, I would like to be assured that the property next to me is also under the same rules and would also upgrade their property so it doesn't take value away from what I've added to my building. The other reason is as we get a little further along where we talk about creating new districts, we're also talking about the same kind of 66%. And Andrea did a lot of research on a lot of different communities in Colorado on this particular issue, and we did see everywhere from just over a majority of the property owners, once they are in a district and they all come into a district, up to 75%, and but there were a number of communities that kind of settled on that 66%, so that's basically where staff settled. So I know this is one of the major policy issues, and we'd be happy to stop right now and answer any questions on that particular part of what we're recommending approving. Yes, ma'am.
What percentage are we at right now?
There is no percentage right now. It's 100%.
Oh, okay.
So,
Well, where would we be?
How many, what percent do
Oh.
we have?
where we are between who's opted in and who has not?
Yeah.
You know what that is?
District. Estimate 55, 60%, something there.
Here, 55, 60%.
55, 60%.
47 buildings.
Well, it's more the number of owners than the buildings.
It's actually the number of separate properties.
But,
Right.
They each
Yeah,
count
but-
as a vote.
yeah, but an owner may have multiple properties.
Correct.
And then each of those counts.
So an owner could have multiple votes.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
But if a property has 3 owners, it still gets 1 vote.
Correct.
That property has a vote.
Right. If it's in a trust or something with numerous owners, that just counts as 1 vote. Right. I'm sorry, we don't know what that percentage is. We can certainly find that out for you.
It sounds like we're probably not that far away from the 66% now. Okay.
Is this the map?
That's the map.
I don't think you're close to 50.
We have a few more on here.
I was going to say, I think that map is
that's
Exhibit
the
A from the
original map.
05
Yeah.
ordinance.
Yeah.
And-
But the one-
and we really need an updated
I
map.
mean, follows these to all of these.
This is the comp plan.
It's just the Main Street piece of them.
That's the comp plan one.
Okay.
It's up to date.
I think Andrew is pretty close, 50, 60% right now. So we're very close to that 66%.
Glenn, could you, I'm sorry.
I'm the-
Well, there are others who want to speak
Oh,
before
I'm
me.
sorry. No. Peggy and
Yeah,
then Jim.
I just have one question. This is called, you keep saying the places along Main Street, but there is at least one, maybe 2, that are on Alamo in the district. I know there are a couple that have separate designations, but the Creamery, for example, is not on Main Street.
Are they part of the Main Street District?
Yes, there are a few properties not on Main Street, and that was because during the process of putting the historic district together, the 3 property owners on Main Street who submitted the application obtained signatures, and those property owners did want to be part of the district.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that they're not all fronting Main Street, which is what,
I did state that.
yeah,
With
I
the-
know you didn't mean bad by it, but I just wanted to clarify.
Appreciate the correction. You're right.
Jim.
Could you remind me why the apartments in the 2300 block were not eligible to ever become part of the district?
I have to, Chief Andrew was here, I believe.
Well, it was a policy that the Historical Preservation Board discussed, talked about, and they felt that because that entire block was primarily non-historic buildings, that it was essentially separate in character from the rest of Main Street, and felt it best to leave as is.
Well, I can tell you by looking at them, they look a lot better than some of them that are eligible to be in the district. And they look a lot more historic than some that are eligible to be in the district. So if the district does include all the properties on Main Street, does it include all the non-conforming buildings as well, which would include these apartments?
The way the Historical Preservation Board has the opt-in district boundary drawn now would exclude that block, and so that's the way it stands for now anyway.
But if this were to pass, and you get the 66%, that's my question. Would the apartments then be included in the district?
No.
No.
No, because they've actually been excluded from the original district.
I still think they look a lot better than some of them that are eligible, so I'd like to see how we can do to change that.
So,
Bruce?
Glenn, can you clarify for me what it means to be non-consensual and be opted in? What does that mean to a property owner?
It basically means the city can opt them into the district without their consent. So it does not require property owner approval.
And what does that do to change their private property rights, you know, as a member of the businesses in Littleton?
That's a concern, and in zoning in general, we deal with that a lot, and I guess I best describe it as it's not just one right, it's a bundle of rights, and zoning or historic preservation may require a couple of those sticks out of that bundle, give up some of your property rights for the overall good of the community. So I guess that's kind of a philosophical way of answering your question, but I also look at the property rights of the person who's maybe right adjacent to that building, and does that adjoining property owner have a right to tear his building down and put up a glass block structure that kind of destroys the context that's been created.
What I see occurring, though, since 2006 is, and we even were talking about it with the map that they had at that time versus now, businesses are opting in. I mean, there seems to be a steady movement to do that. I'm wondering why we don't let time just work its way through this as economic situations change and as owners' intents change and property owners change. What is the rush that we would want to do that now by creating a percentage, an opt-in and a non-consensual at this time?
Well, I think ultimately you could arrive at that 100%, but I think that's a bit unrealistic. I think you'll always have a holdout, and you'll always have an incomplete district. So, I mean, you can certainly give it time and see when you get to that point. That would be one option of looking at it, and see how successful we are of getting people to opt in.
And I think Andrea might be able to add a little bit to this because we are a highly unusual situation in the state of Colorado with the opt-in, aren't we? Andrea, you've done a lot of research on that.
Yes, I'm only aware of one other opt-in district in the state, and that's in Fruita. I think Manitou Springs has kind of gone back and forth with it, and currently they're all-inclusive. It makes sense, I think, in a lot of cases to have everyone within the district because then you have a fair playing field. Everyone is subject to the same rules and regulations. And for a property owner to put a lot of money restoring their property, they want the assurances that the person next to them or across the street is going to be sharing in that same vision and preserving their property as well, as opposed to being out of the district where currently under regulations we could have something like a chain drugstore or chain restaurant move in without the benefit of any historic preservation review.
Becky and then Bruce.
So clarify for me, the question Jim asked about the buildings that aren't included, and I understood the answer, then Bruce's question. So if we had 66%, or we decided everybody now has to come in, would the buildings that Jim asked about come in? Or they would still be excluded?
They'd still be excluded. The only way those would come in is if we changed the boundary, which is possible, but we're not recommending that.
So
But
I don't follow the logic of what you all were just saying in terms of why some people should be coming in, even though they're non-consensual, if we are excluding people who are right there on the same street facing the same way doing business. It makes no sense to me. I mean,
do you want me to?
Well, one thing that I guess kind of our next topic is contributing, non-contributing, and how we put that designation on the property. And I think originally, and Andrea, jump in here if I'm off base, I think the apartments were looked at as being non-contributing, and there was no way they could architecturally become contributing to the district. So do they really add to the overall cohesiveness of the district? And I think the feeling at the time was, no, they're really different from the, and one thing they look at is the period of significance of the development of Main Street. So we look at a period of roughly 1880 to 1970. Are these, do the Main Street apartments reflect the design of the period that they were constructed enough to add to the history of the district? And I think they were probably new enough that they were out of that period of time. So the decision was made to leave them out.
but we have, if I'm reading this right, we have the store on the corner of Prince and Main on the southeast corner, where there are apartments, around and above. So that's not in that store on the corner, right?
That's a Colorado frame.
Colorado Frame?
Yep.
I mean, it's not designated on the map. And then across Main Street, next to Sycamore, those aren't in. But I'm just looking at where the spaces are here, and I'm not following still the logic of some things being old enough and sort of looking the same way or whatever, but they're non-contributing versus some other things that might, as Jim said, look more like some stuff, but for some reason, they can't be included. Not that I'm arguing right now one way or the other whether they should be. I'm just trying to hear the...
Right. Well, that was the decision made at the time, and there's no reason we can't go back and reevaluate that decision.
Bruce, and then Jerry. Bruce Stallman.
When Historic Preservation Board did the True Grit presentations or program a couple of years ago, I think it was like 08, 09, Nori Winter came in, and a fellow that's done a lot of this work around the country, and I think he had indicated that the voluntary opt-in districts are really unusual. Having said that, it certainly has a tradition of functioning in Littleton, and it seems to work pretty well. What we're talking about, really, there's not a boatload of incentives for being in the district other than the parking waiver and then the state tax credits. Well, and might be some federal tax credits as well. Yeah, okay.
Right.
So, but those are there whether we force people in or whether it's non-consensual or whether they opt in. So if you want to take advantage of the tax credits, you can do that if you own a property. There's always been conversations about higher insurance rates, and my understanding of that was predominantly speaking based on the research that was done. I don't know that I've ever gotten definitive sensation that insurance rates are actually higher for buildings that are in the historic district or historically designated buildings, but I know some people feel that way. Even if you don't come into the district, you're still more or less subject to DRC as it exists. So, for example, Merle's. The old Skelly station more or less probably should have at minimum been on list of merit. Probably, I know we tried to get Dave Svensson to bring the Skelly station into the district. There was some negotiating. He decided against doing it. Ultimately, he didn't do it. Planning Commission went ahead with it, and Bob's your uncle. It is what it is. Mm-hmm. And Merle's is fine. But Merle's, while not within the context of the pure historic preservation orientation, still meshes reasonably well a la the tavern and so forth and so on, even though the tavern technically is in the district, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would use circled. So, I guess at the end of the day, forgive me for saying this, this one sort of seems like a solution in search of a little bit of a problem. Because I'm not getting the sensation that, if we were to continue on doing what we are doing and people want it in, we'll get to the non-contributing structures in a minute. But, if people want in, they can come in. I know there's been some conversation over time about Details, that the old movie theater there that Details is not in because the fellow that owns it didn't want to bring it in, but that may change at some point. Mm-hmm. Certainly it would be a contributing structure.
Right.
But given, I guess I'm sort of scuffling trying to understand exactly why, I get sort of what you said about the 66%, but I'm not seeing major downside for not doing anything. And I'm not seeing where anybody has been overtly disadvantaged by having a structure in the next, not having a structure opted in next to a structure that is in where there's been property value decrementing as a result of that. Is there any examples of that? I can't think of any. Maybe you guys.
Not yet.
I don't know that. Yeah, we could actually quantify that, but.
Maybe a post office, to be honest.
One thing to keep in mind is if you're not in the district and you're putting a new facade on your building,
Right.
or you're doing an addition under 500 square feet, there would not be architectural review, or there would not be design review, review of it.
So was Fat Frog, was that the,
Would the design guidelines, though, the downtown design guidelines kick in?
No. It would really be a permit, basically, at that point. We wouldn't have a right to review their architecture.
You just lost me. So who are the downtown design guidelines for, if not for downtown?
Well, if they're going through DRC or they're going through Planning Commission through a PDO, then we'd use the downtown design guidelines
Okay,
if they're not within the district.
okay.
Yeah.
Jerry.
In,
Oh, sorry, Glenn. You
no, just to clarify again, if they're doing addition under 500 square feet or they're just redoing the facade and they're not in the district, there wouldn't be any reason we could force them through an architectural review. So that was really kind of one of the driving forces of trying to get that automatic, the rubber band just includes everybody when we hit the 66%. It's a risk. You know, I don't know what the level of that risk is, but that was one of the concerns. Now, we could always revise the code and take out that loophole that's in there now and perhaps make sure that there's some kind of review of a facade up to a certain percentage. That's something we could look at, certain dollar value or percentage of the overall value.
Cool. I definitely like the downtown feel, the historic feel and all that stuff, and I remember when we were going through all this stuff many years ago. But I have a question. I think this is more for Kirsten. I know this isn't a taking of some sort, but it almost gives me the feel of almost a taking when you're requiring somebody to do something. It'd be like the federal government telling us to buy something we don't necessarily want. Can't imagine that ever happening, huh? Is this something along that line, though? It's not a taking, but we're making somebody do something when they didn't ask for it. They may eventually want it, but they didn't ask for it.
No, actually, the vast majority of these sort of non-consensual designations do get upheld now under a zoning analysis. But there is that resistance and reluctance still, even, I don't know why it hasn't caught up in communities to have more of embracing or acceptance of these sort of regulations. The only case I can think of in Colorado, in the state of Colorado, that got struck down was in, I think, Georgetown, and that was a designation that essentially was the whole community versus being able to articulate. For instance, ours is, we have such good criteria to articulate why we've chosen this boundary.
It just concerns me a little bit that property rights have always been such a big deal for Americans, period. And now we're like going, you can have whatever property you want, but we're going to make you do something now. I just don't like the feel of that. I do like the historic designation, and I think it really brings the community together when those property owners and business owners all opt in on their own. I think it gives them a good feel for it. But I think by forcing others to maybe do something they don't necessarily want at this time, I think it gives a lot of heartburn to folks. And that's what I remember back, was it 2005 or whenever it was we did this originally? I remember some of the feelings that folks had back then. The idea of just making people do something, it didn't sit well with a lot of folks. So that's it.
Bruce.
I'd like to amplify what Jerry just said. I remember I happened to be in this room at the study session where I think it was Ruth Graham came in and finally found a consensus and a way to come together after what I think was a real separation of folks in the community. I think there were some very deep wounds, and they came together with this ordinance and basically healed most of the wounds and brought those that wanted to forward. I would have trouble with opening that issue up again. I think some of those same issues would probably exist. It hasn't been that long.
I'm feeling a consensus. But we can move on if you'd like.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just a point of order, though, the B1 has 2 points to it. One was to create that process, and the second one was the 66%. So I just want to make clear what it is we're moving on from.
You're in favor of the process, but not the automatic 66%, and you're in the district. That's the sense I'm getting.
Well, talk about the process, I guess, because my understanding of this thing was that if you wanted in, you were in. That's a pretty easy process. I think the only time I can recall it ever not working that way was that, what's his name's little electric building, which was strictly, as I understood it, the result of the non-contributing. But there was, as far as historic preservation professional attributes are concerned, historic districts can have non-contributing structures. Ergo, if somebody wants to opt into the district and they've got a non-contributing structure, why would we not want them in the district? Or why should they have to go through a process? Why can't they just raise their hand and say, I want to get in?
Right, right. I think we're not requiring much more than that as far as the process. We don't even require an application at this point. So I think we just want to formalize that. I don't think the intent was that we would create an onerous process to come in. Just a little bit more information than we get right now. And there is some criteria which we haven't developed. If there ever is a situation where the council wants to say no, you need to kind of base that on some kind of criteria. And we would basically be developing that.
But is that what's in the code today? If it's just opt-in, why does council want to say no? Or why, the code doesn't even talk about council saying no. It just basically says people can opt in.
That's right. This actually was an issue I think that council did, at least at some point, want us to look at, because when these applications do come in, there's nothing set in writing about how we proceed. So we would like to get that clarified.
So what exactly is the process?
There's nothing in the code right now, and we'd like permission to at least propose something. That's right.
So what are you thinking?
An application, and then would it go through, do you think you'd want it to go through HPB or just straight to council?
I would think it would go straight to council, unless they're changing the facade and they need a certificate of appropriateness, or there's some other reason they'd have to go through another board. But if not, I don't know why they would necessarily need to go through Historic Preservation Board if it's just to be added to the district.
Peggy?
So clarify, I mean, the one that you mentioned on the corner where Andy Marquez most recently was, that did come before council. I think it was January or February of '08, and I think it was a 4-3 vote, and they didn't get in. So they had to come to us. Somebody decided that had to come to us.
That's about all it says, is that it'll go to council for a hearing. So what we'd want to say is that there's an opportunity for people to challenge it, other property owners, and that you will vote on it. It can be as simple as that.
Okay.
Okay, Jerry?
A question on the level of, or the buildings that are not considered historic or whatever. But as Jim mentioned, that one block, while it isn't historic necessarily, but it does look historic on the 2300 block. And while Richard Little may not have slept there,
That we know of.
maybe he did. Is it possible that there could be a different level of designation to be in the district? Yes, they want to be in that district, and they will commit to keeping their building looking historic or along that line, but just at a different level, knowing that it isn't historic.
Are they on the list of merit, do you know, Andrea? I mean, we have another level of designation, so to speak, with the list of merit. I don't know if they would qualify for that.
Main Street apartments? No, because they're not historic.
But the very reason that you gave a while ago about having neighboring buildings that are historic and ones next to them or across the street, this block is a prime example of what could happen. Because who's going to say that the owner's not going to come in there and put a glass sheet in front of every one of those facades and just leave door openings to get into the existing businesses that are down there, and you can't do a thing one about it unless you make some changes in the code.
Yeah, again, that was the original decision, and we can certainly go back and look at it. As and we'll get to it a little bit as we get through the memo a little bit. There are many different levels. You have your landmark at the kind of the top, and then you have your contributing property, non-contributing, and then the HVB has list of merit. So perhaps there's a designation, or perhaps it's more of a protection. As you mentioned, maybe there is a reason to add those apartments now into the district.
Bruce and then Peggy.
I don't know if I feel strongly about this or not from the standpoint of the overall process. What you're describing doesn't strike me as unreasonable. At the same point in time, though, it's almost, it does strike me as a little bit of unnecessary by virtue of the fact that if the code says they can just opt in, then I don't know that I feel council should necessarily say otherwise. And you're right. I mean, I understand what happened in '08, and with all due respect to that council, I think that if he wanted in, that building should have gone in, whether it was contributing or otherwise. It isn't, and so that's okay. But, you know, the whole concept of having a process suggests that people should be able to say no, and my feeling on it is if somebody wants in the district, boom, you're in.
Well, then we should say that at least in the code, that there is no process.
I thought
You're
that's
just
what it-
allowed to.
No, but I thought that's what it,
I don't think it's that clear, no. We can go back and look at it,
Okay.
but I do think if that's what you want it to be, at least when it comes to you, you're going to know you don't have a whole lot of discretion. You have to let the property owners in. And I don't think
to Bruce's point, I mean, or Jerry's point, I mean, if they want in, it's their property, let them in.
that's right. And I think, would need to say that in the code at least.
With that particular property, though, one of the reasons why it didn't get 4 votes, it's supposed to be historic, in existence for 40 years, and that building had not been in existence for 40 years. It had been in existence for like 34 or 35.
Okay.
And that was one of the reasons why it did not meet that 40-year criteria that is currently in the code.
Okay, and so maybe that is something that is appropriate to elaborate as far as the process conversation. I mean, but again, that almost seems like it's definitive enough that says you get past the 40-year threshold, you can raise your hand and say, I want in, you're in. And I understand if they weren't there, then they probably shouldn't have they should have been told you can't get in because you're not 40. Which is ultimately what council said, but probably they should have been said at the administrative level.
Yeah, but what happened, because you can be admitted on one or more of the criteria that are in there. And I was on the board, the liaison to the board at the time. I read that, the code inside out, upside down, every direction I could come at it to get a handle on it, and I recommended at the time that the code needed to be clarified. So I voted in favor of it because one of the things is the kind of activities that occurred on the property, not in the building, but on the property, that was part of the historic downtown
It was a gas station.
behavior.
Yeah. Right.
Well, even before that, before there were gas stations. It was behavior that occurred on all of Main Street, and that was one of those properties. Look at Bega Park. There's no building at all, right? And the tavern got brought in because of behavior on the property, not because of a building. The building came after that.
Actually, that one was the dirt, that was the only one where the dirt
Historic.
was designated, wasn't it?
Historic dirt.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think Bega the same thing. But anyway, so, that was one of the reasons that, that indicates one of the reasons things need to get clarified a little bit. But if we're looking at this, and since I said, how come the creamery's in there, because it's not there, if I'm trying to figure out, I can see where the properties are that are in here and so forth. I understand Main Street, but I'm looking at a little band that maybe is larger than just fronting Main Street because of some of what's already historic, let's say on Alamo.
So your view, from your standpoint, then, the clarification of the code needs to be, what are the clarifications that need to take place?
Well, I'd like to see a little band drawn around whatever it is theoretically that is the district. And then if you opt in, it's like your property's in what's designated, but you haven't opted to be part of it yet, right? You haven't decided to be an official part. But it's around you, you just aren't technically a functioning part of it. I guess it's a little bit like hoodlums. Some people belong, some don't, but there's that area that people can if they want. Anyway, I just think a lot of things need to get clarified.
It seems like there's two issues in front of you. One is, do you want to change the boundaries? And then the other is, do you want a process? Do you want to be able to say no, or is the opt-in a right, in essence, from it? And that, I think, would address Councilmember Cole's question, because you would be, technically, you already be within in the boundary to be able to say, I want to opt in, and then we can look at the specific details. Because Glenn has said several times, if the council wants to look at that again, we certainly can, but we're living with the historic code, if you will.
And as to the second issue, the opt-in, so what we have in there right now under 4-6-9 is procedures for designation of landmarks and historic districts, and so we've kind of used that historically to, no pun intended, to apply to opting in, and that is not what it says at all. And so we can do it administratively and just say they get in, and all they need to do is do an application to community development, or it can come to council, it can be a hybrid and go to HPB and then come to council, but we have to have something to deal with the properties that opt in. That's what I
It's
think.
the last one I'm familiar with was the Boussard and the Blue Ribbon Stables, and we did that by ordinance. And I'm assuming we did that by ordinance because they're now under additional regulation. So if there's a way to get around that, then, or do it another way, yeah, I think we're all for it.
Bruce?
Is there a need for a landowner, when they have this condition placed on their land, to file that with the county, and does it affect the value of it? Because now it has a new designation. It's kind of like a covenant.
You mean if they opt in?
If they opt in, if they've created I'm using the term covenant, by which they're going to operate, and if I was a homeowner, that covenant would be part of the sale of the property, would be...
I'm pretty sure it is, because
I thought it said in here that they have to file, the owner files with the county, I thought.
Because if so, my point would be, I would like it to be a document or something, rather, something spelled out, in accordance with a resolution or an ordinance. This is their status, so that it could be reviewed and be seen.
Okay.
Something that's recorded against the property.
Absolutely.
I think it is.
Well, I think it's more, right, it's more of a zoning category, and we don't necessarily record a particular zoning ordinance against a property.
There's something
We have the
that I
official
read.
map.
I thought I read it in here, because I read the whole code about twice in the past 2 days. I thought that the owner files something.
Can I suggest that we get we hear the question and we can check on it, but to me, you guys, we need you to address the policy question of, do you want to change the boundary, and do you want to have, as Kirsten has identified, where would you like the procedural component of the opt-in, the route to go through for that. To me, those are the two questions that are currently on the table that you guys have been identifying as issues for you.
And staff recommendation, at least as to the opt-in, would be that it comes to you, but then we make it clear that you don't have any discretion, that if that's the way you want to go, that there's no discretion, really, it's just a ministerial approval.
She just wanted to say that again.
Didn't want to say
Why
that.
would it come to us?
Yeah.
It's good to do zoning through the public process. That's the way we've done it. We'd have to go back and look at state statute and see if there's anything in state statute that requires us to do it. But we can look at that and bring it back to you. But that would be my recommendation, is that we put it to council.
Well, I don't have a problem conceptually myself expanding the district. I think if somebody comes in and says, I want to be in, and administratively it passes muster based on, because I recall the criteria Peggy's talking about, there's a couple dozen or 15 or 13 of them, that you go through to, 15. But administratively, that can be done, and you can say, okay, they meet, numbers 3 and number 8. And then it goes to council from a ministerial perspective. But you've still got sort of the bugaboo regarding the issue of the parking incentive, which has sort of been traditionally the biggest carrot, I guess, that we have to offer. And it seems to exacerbate some of the problems downtown with parking in a general sense. So, for example, the tavern comes in and gets an exemption for parking. So this sort of ends up being part and parcel of the overall parking conundrum, if you will. They get the tax credits are out of our control, and that's great. We've got the discretionary 25 or 50K that we give for facade improvements, and that's a bit of a carrot that some property owners have taken advantage of, and that's great also. But then the bigger one is, if you're going to open the district up, beyond just what it is today, and you get, first of all, do you know if there are other properties out there outside of the existing district boundaries that have expressed interest?
In coming into the district?
Right.
Not that I'm aware of. Andrew, have you ever?
There have been a few over the years that they've wanted the either the grant program or the parking incentive.
Yeah. See, I think this is, I'm conceptually, I don't have a problem with it, but I think we probably, or we're going to point you, probably need to spend a little bit of time noodling on what impact the parking incentive may have vis-a-vis the overall parking.
Right. Yeah. I heard that's a great problem.
That's a good problem.
I'm not saying it's a bad problem. I'm saying it has continually been expressed as certainly something that contributes to what some perceive to be a problem, others perceive to be an advantage.
Well, one thing, just to clarify on the parking issue, the waiver is if you're doing an addition and there's additional parking required for that, it reduces it 50%. So it's not, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. Now, you're right. If we expand the district by 25%, then that would be something we'd want to take a look at.
Jerry?
So, Michael, you're looking for a direction on where to go with this thing, right? Is it?
We are indeed, yes.
That's kind of what I was getting. I think as long as if it could address this non-consensual mandatory opt-in thing, also the boundaries, including the non-historical type properties, the parking, I think that's something that's a big issue. That's more than just this historical thing altogether. But if you could bring it back with addressing those, that'd be great.
Certainly. And then,
No, I'm sorry. I'll wait.
and then on the process side of it, because we will, and I would assume we'll work with HPB on some of these issues as well. The process is probably a staff one, but when we talk about going back and revisiting, some of these will route back through HPB as well.
Does that process include like the HP bringing their recommendation?
These have actually been vetted through, correct?
Yes.
What you have this evening.
Yes, correct. And as far as if somebody just simply wants to opt into the district and they're not modifying their building at this time, it would not require HPB. However, any other amendments after they opt in certainly would go through HPB.
And I meant, actually, when we take your directions and go to work on it, some of these will be working with HPB on,
Yes.
is what I intended to say. So, thanks.
Glenn, it says under B1 that the process should consist of an application, new criteria, HPB hearing, and recommendations in council public hearing.
Well, it sounds like you are, I'm getting the
That's what
feeling
you
that
guys are recommending.
That was the recommendation. It
Okay.
sounds like we've gotten away from that, and we have more of a feeling for just allowing them in.
They say they want to opt in, if they meet all the criteria, they go. I say if they miss a certain number of criteria, then maybe they come to council? What if they miss one criteria?
I think the way we were envisioning it, and we can write it really any way you want, is that it would just come to council. There wouldn't be a review of criteria at staff level. And we haven't set any criteria yet.
My concern with that is if it comes to council and it's in a public hearing format and there's a dust-up about it, and like the electric building, and there's other people who come down in a public hearing and say no, I mean, what are we basing our decision on at that point? Because if it's just administratively, we're pushing them through council to keep it public, well, we could hit an interesting hearing snag on that. So what, Bruce?
I think the way it normally got interpreted, or was supposed to have been interpreted, was if there are a handful of criteria, and if you meet any of them,
Right.
you can get in. You don't have to have, so in theory, if staff identifies that somebody raises their hand and says, I want in, and they look at the building and says, okay, it meets at least one of these criteria, then in theory, that was sufficient for it to go forward. And I don't know if it's a public hearing at that point, it's more of just sort of almost a consent agenda, just to sort of.
That's right. We could do it that way. That would be a good idea.
Because then it meets the land use attributes of
Council approval, yes.
yeah,
Public process, but not public input.
That would
because
be,
it met a criteria,
that would be a good idea.
if we stipulate the criteria in the code. Yeah.
Peggy?
So I'm still struggling with this. Now, part of it I'm not struggling with. I don't think that people should be forced to come in. I don't support the non-consensual. But apart from that, and I look at the incentives, the various incentives, and I go back to ask myself the question, why do we have a historic downtown district? And it's, as I understand it, it's to preserve, it's for several reasons, one of which is to preserve that historic visual character, a physical character that people see. And one of the incentives was to potentially, we don't have enough money to help everybody, but is to help preserve that through various kinds of grants. So if we would have people coming in who have buildings that really aren't all that distinct, and they want a grant because now it's their turn or something or other. I know it doesn't happen that way, but I'm phrasing it that way. I mean, is that right? We have limited money. We've got several buildings already. So what is it we're really trying to achieve with this district? We already, it seemed to me, have achieved a hell of a lot because it seems to me mighty darn busy most of the time, no matter what the buildings look like. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean the mix. The fact that they look pretty good, whatever they mix, is still bringing people here. If they start deteriorating, then we're in trouble and probably people won't keep coming. So what is it we're really trying to achieve? And I think the statement in the code is what we have to keep in mind. So although part of me would like to just call this whole thing the historic downtown Littleton, which the signs suggest, most people don't know which buildings are in and not and whatever, then what do we gain and what do the buildings gain that aren't in by coming in? So I'm just wanting to hear some other people articulate.
Well, couple things. I mean, if you can get in, you can avail yourself of state and federal tax credits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The facade grants are administered by the Historic Preservation Board, so I think they make the determination in terms of certainly greatest need, greatest impact, and a lot of times people weren't stepping up, so it ended up being first in the pool. But generally speaking, I trust their judgment to administer them to where they need to be. So if you have a non-contributing structure, my sense would be you're probably not going to get a facade grant if somebody who has a contributing structure wants to get one. The parking issue sort of is the wild card. If you are non-contributing but you want a parking waiver, yeah, I think that's a bit of a loophole kind of issue. But predominantly, I think the reason you'd get in if you were non-contributing, or you just, in particular, would be because it would give you the opportunity to upgrade your structure, presumably increase its property value, and get a tax credit in the process.
Well, again, if given all the competition for the grants, somebody may or may not get that. And right now, people also get the sales use tax waiver if they're in the district, and the building permit fee waiver for the facade work.
Okay.
So being in the district would give that additional benefit, quite apart from the parking, would give that benefit. That affects city revenue, but I suspect it's not that big an effect on the city revenue. But you got those pieces. So,
Jim?
I kind of tend to agree with what Peggy was saying, that instead of a Main Street Historic District, we needed to have looked at a downtown historic district. There are buildings around there that are like terracotta, like the Barrister Building, like the Leach House, like the old bus depot, like the buildings where the antique stores are now on Alamo. All of those are historic buildings. They meet numbers of criteria to be in a historic district, but they're not on Main Street. We did curve around and pick up the J.D. Hill building and the Creamery to put them in that historic district, which the Creamery is on Alamo. But could we look at those boundaries wider than just Main Street, that it's going to include both sides of Alamo, and it's going to include the area clear to Powers on the north side. So it picks up some more of those older buildings on Sycamore and on Nevada that might be, they would probably be eligible to come into the district. That's question one. I think we need to stay as an opt-in district. I would like to see incentives being increased, and looking at how we can do that, I think would be another discussion. I'd like to see the 2300 block be allowed to become part of the district. And I'd like to see changes in the code that's going to close the loophole about the buildings in the district that can do facade changes and the 500 square feet, that at least it has some sort of review so that we know what's going to go on and how it's going to affect property owners on either side of them. So.
Bruce?
I'll definitely agree with Jim on that last point. I was thinking exactly the same thing, that we really need to, if somebody wants to do a facade change and they're not in the district and it's more than X amount of money, somebody needs to just make sure it's not, 8 stories in mass or whatever it is.
Jerry?
I was suggesting he speak into his microphone.
Oh, I think you can pick up.
You'd be surprised at home. As someone who listens to these things for many years, it's sitting back makes a huge difference.
Fair point. All I said was I agree with Jim's point about doing something to make sure we cover the facade changes in buildings that haven't opted in if they're looking to make an alteration from an architectural review standpoint.
Okay.
Okay, let's go one more time around. Does anybody else have anything? Then we'll move on. Is everybody?
Let me do-
Bruce?
And that is reflected in the downtown comp plan, that movement toward more historical preservation. So I think we're going right down the path.
So what we will do in this area is we'll look at options for expansion of the district. We will develop that process, bring that back to council based upon the discussion that you had. Councilman Taylor did add increase incentives, so we'll at least look at that. I think it's been raised an issue around parking, so it's probably worthy of us spending some time on it, and we will develop code to close the loophole on this section. So,
Very good.
Glenn, pursuant to the mayor's request, why don't you move us on?
Okay.
Well, I do have one comment, though. Sorry. You know, you look at different historic districts, and particularly you get into Denver, and you look at some of the historic homes and some of the historic buildings, and it's a privilege and an honor to be designated that. And part of it is because it carries just a air of prestige and cool. I don't want to see us bastardize that aura of history that I think is what a true historic district, what makes it so incredible, that love of history. I don't want to see us get that all tweaked out of shape because people are coming in for taxes and paint and parking. I think the criteria to be able to pass one criteria on that list is loose. I think that's disingenuous to what I think the value and prestige of a historic district is. I would like to see us tighten that up a little bit, make it a little bit more of a, I don't want it to be a huge challenge for people to get in, but I think that if there's some criteria in there, that maybe they have to wait a few more years before their building gets older, or maybe there is some things that they need to do on their own in order to be able to get in. And if we're making this, everybody receives that benefit of that district kind of having that energy and synergy of historic. The signs all say it. People refer to it as that. They come down here because they're looking for that older charm. And I just don't think it should be given away. I mean, I think that I'm all about the property rights. I think if they want to opt in, they should be able to opt in. But I think that the criteria we have to just have to pass one of those is, it's almost like, why have it? You know, I'd just like to see us take another look at that and see if there may be a way to make that a little bit more of a,
I think it'd be safe for us to come back with a couple options on that as part of that process.
everybody cool with all?
Yeah.
Okay.
You guys can.
And with that, in those criteria, in 466A8, has undergone significant historic remodel. Wait till you find that. Did you find it, Glenn? Did you find that?
Which one under A?
Number
I'm sorry.
8, in 466A, number 8.
What's the question?
That's the criteria for designation?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I see it.
there is no definition of remodel. I think the word needs to be changed to one of the words in the definitions, like reconstruction or something or other, or preferably put a definition in for historic remodel. You know, because historic remodel in one person's head could be remodeling this room to make it look 100 years old.
Or
which
it was
is-
done 50 years ago, the remodel.
You know, anyway, so I think that
Okay.
it relates to one of what Debbie's saying.
Keep moving.
Okay, all right.
Oh, Bruce.
I was just going to comment, I think, on your point, which is not at all unfair. Just the contrarian point of view, just to express it, is the other side of that is if to the extent that we encourage more consideration of what could be considered historic, the more, I think, maybe people pay attention to it. So I don't disagree with your point that it'd be nice to have a couple of, at least 2 or 3 criteria to sort of say, okay, this one's actually really getting it done versus just they sort of waved at it as they went by. But on the other hand, if we encourage people, then maybe that broader appreciation for the history that you're talking about spreads out a little bit, and people have maybe better visibility or better awareness of the fact that there are historic criteria that they can take advantage of and that they can acknowledge. So that's all I was going to say.
I'm confident we can come back with some options for you to discuss in great detail.
Glenn?
Okay, paragraph C. Staff feels we need to actually identify the contributing properties within the historic district, so we're showing you 2 options. One is when we bring back these ordinance changes, the intent is that we actually designate those properties that are identified as contributing, or we can do it on a case-by-case basis as people want to opt in. I think we kind of talked about we want to streamline that process, so I think staff would recommend number 1 in this case, so that we all do it up front with these code amendments that we're bringing forward.
Everybody okay with that? Bruce and then Jim.
Again, I mean, from my perspective on this stuff, if contributing structure is one that, you know it when you see it. So the courthouse, Carnegie Library, Town Hall Arts Center are all clearly contributing structures. Whereas, I don't know, something, pick one. There are plenty of non-contributing structures that could potentially be in the district. If, for my money, if they meet enough of the criteria to get in, I think there's, and again, historic preservationists will tell you that an historic district is comprised of both contributing and non-contributing structures. I'm not sure what the designation, what it really means from the standpoint of putting it in the code, because I wouldn't be inclined to keep somebody out who wanted in, who met the criteria, even if their property was non-contributing.
It really relates to, I think, the next paragraph where we talk about, do you want to differentiate incentives between contributing and non-contributing? I believe that's the reason why we designated it here. So if you want to move to like paragraph D, that's the question. Do we want the current incentives, which you mentioned is the parking reduction, the tax incentives, the potential for a Main Street grant, facade grant, to apply to contributing versus non-contributing? That was the question posed to HPB, and they certainly fell on the side of everybody ought to have a shot at it, because you can certainly, there is a potential to bring a non-contributing building to a contributing status. So I think that was the purpose of paragraph C and D there.
Questions? Jim?
I think I agree with what Bruce just said. Once you've got a district going that's been created, and a non-contributing district, a building wants to come in, if they meet enough of the criteria that's established for them to come in, I think they should be allowed to come in. I guess what I really would like to see is when this comes back to us the next time with a very updated map of the downtown district as it exists now, and also those buildings on Main Street that are now non-contributing to the historic district, because I don't know which ones they are. And somebody had to make that determination which ones were and were not.
Well, it's something that staff's been working with the Historical Preservation Board on, And so nothing's been set in stone at this point, just been discussed so far.
Jim, I would think, for example, just for an example, and you know, no disrespect intended, it just is what it is. We talked about the Broussard property, probably is a non-contributing structure versus the Melting Pot or versus Town Hall Arts Center. That doesn't mean they couldn't upgrade it.
I think we're looking at the Blue Ribbon Stables as a contributing
Do you
structure.
think it would be?
Well,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
What criteria do you have for contributing?
That-
Do you have,
No, and
oh,
that's
so
the
we're just
problem.
winging it?
That's the issue.
That's wrong.
the issue. That's exactly the issue, because we toss that around a lot at historic preservation, and nobody knows what it is. Maybe Andrea is the...
Only Andrea
Well,
knows.
only Andrea knows.
Jerry and then Bruce.
So when I think of a property like Merle's, and you'd mentioned Merle's is getting a waiver on some of the parking, is there anybody here that doesn't think that Merle's has contributed to the activity in downtown? I mean, whether it's Merle's or the tavern, I mean, maybe they're not in the historic district, but they are what's making downtown what it is.
Contributing in this context is from an historic fabric.
I tell you what, if they didn't bring people down there, we wouldn't have to worry about this conversation right now. There's many of the owners been down there through thick and thin. And I think when Merle's came in and Dave decided to do what he did, he brought a lot of people to downtown. And that's creating this whole buzz with downtown. It's helping to create it. So I don't like the idea of kind of like knocking on somebody for getting a waiver when they have, I think, contributed heavily to the success of downtown.
No, I completely agree. Yeah, the issue there was the old Skelly gas station. No, you're 110% correct. Merle's is great.
Oh, absolutely. And what Dave tried to do is, while he didn't keep the old building, he still kept a historic feel to it, and that was great.
Yeah, no, I agree.
We're probably getting off topic again. Is that right?
At least you recognize it.
Thank you.
Bruce, did you have?
Clarification, in the definitions, contributing structure is defined. So we know what a contributing structure is.
Right.
What we don't know is what a non-contributing structure is. Just for clarification.
Well,
Glenn, I want to cut the conversation. Glenn, if the council were to, on D1, take the staff and HPB recommendation, maybe this is a question for Kirsten as well, do we care about paragraph C? If we're basically saying they will all be treated the same.
Well, no, but as you'll see with 2, 3, and 4, we're really talking about treating them differently from a demolition standpoint, the rules for demolition, or what design guidelines we use. We have 2 sets of design guidelines. So that's really the reason of formalizing what's contributing and non-contributing.
Glenn, why don't you walk us through 2, 3, and 4 before
Okay.
we, and let's listen to Glenn before we start. We may learn something.
Wow, it's a lot of pressure now.
Okay.
that's getting us past what we were just doing, and I wanted to
Well, I
comment
think,
more.
no, I think what Glenn is saying is they're kind of interrelated, and so if we pull that down, listen, hear what Glenn has to say, and then let's go in and ask our questions after, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Number 2 has to do when you go through for a certificate of appropriateness through the Historic Preservation Board, what criteria will be required of a contributor and a non-contributor. They could basically be different in levels of scale. Number 3 is we have 2 sets of design guidelines. We have the Historic Preservation Design Guidelines, and then we also have, as we mentioned before, the Littleton Design Guidelines. What we recommend is the non-contributors follow the downtown guidelines, and the contributors follow this higher level of review from the HPB. That is number 3. Right now, our demolition ordinance basically treats everything the same, and there's a lot of restrictions on what you can tear down, and what we're suggesting in number 4 is there may be criteria for certain non-contributing structures where they could be demolished. So that's basically in a nutshell what 2, 3, and 4 stand for. So for any of those to work, we really have to designate what a contributor is, what a non-contributor is, and what properties they are. And
Yeah, so several things. So see if I can answer,
Untangle that.
respond to something you just said and then back up in a way that's connected to what I was going to add earlier. Some of the things that I might think are non-contributing might be hiding underneath something that would be contributing. Like, I mean, downtown at various times has had different kinds of either facelifts or really heavy makeup over something you didn't know what was underneath.
correct.
Because I went to that last public discussion of some of those guidelines for downtown, about 6 months ago or something. And if you peel stuff off, there might be something under there that's absolutely super, right?
Correct.
And sometimes you don't know unless you have the history, and one of the buildings that was illustrated was nobody had records of what might be, if anything, significant might be behind something. Anyway, so that gets complicated, I think. But I wanted to respond, to add to what Bruce Beckman was saying about definition of contributing structure. Maybe I think we've only had 2 or 3 things come to council, maybe 3, since I've been on council related to historic preservation. And what I thought I was supposed to do, I did, and I might not have done it right, but anyway, I looked at the definitions like contributing structure and cultural landscape and so forth, but I looked particularly at the criteria in 466. And it seems to me those are pretty specific if you take all that in combination. Now, there is a little bit of little room for wiggle on a couple of them, but it seems to me they're fairly clear. And if you look at what's in 466A, anything that doesn't meet at least one of those, in my head, is non-contributing.
Well, I don't think it's so clear because the way I interpret it, when you go back and look at the code as a whole, this is written to apply to landmarks. And again, it doesn't clarify that it talks about properties within the opt-in boundaries. So I think it needs to be clarified.
Okay.
I mean, maybe the definition could encompass
Could
something
do
in the
that.
list.
And see, that's one of the places of slippage. There's some places in here that it seems you're talking about both a district and a landmark,
That's right.
and some where you're talking only one.
That's right.
But each time I go after it big time, I figure, somebody just wasn't real careful with the way they differentiated that. And there is, I'll give you my copy, there's at least one place where there's definitely an error, because one word is used in a whole section that applies to both. Anyway, so it would seem to me, if we looked at that, the historic piece of it, whether it's a district or a structure, that these things, or a property, these things, it seems to me, can relate to either.
That's probably true.
Anyway.
Jerry?
Can you remind me what we're supposed to be doing here?
So,
Well,
go ahead. To decide whether we can define non-contributing, we'd like to put a proposed definition into the code so that everybody understands what the rules are for definition of non-contributing. And then we have some of the subsections that are listed in D that we can go
So we're just looking to come to some sort of a consensus on what it should be, and then you guys are going to run out and do your thing.
That's right. Yes.
But
All right.
then we have the question of, do non-contributing structures are they eligible for some and/or all of the incentives?
That's right.
Well, then you have all of the D, and the reason that Glenn wanted to identify all of the D is because that emphasizes the need to define non-contributing in there. And so, yeah, so procedurally, Jerry, just so you know, so you guys are giving us policy direction. Yes, you support getting a definition as an example for non-contributing. We will then come back, and depending upon what we think the complexity, hopefully we'll do a good job, and we're confident, and we'll bring it back for first reading, and then you guys really can wordsmith the code to make sure that we've identified it. If there's enough, we might bring it back to study session through, still with the language of the code, just to identify that or ensure that we've got it nailed down. But this is not the wordsmith code language tonight. It's just the overall policy direction. Do you support a non-contributing definition and these 4 items that Glenn has just identified?
Cool.
Yay, nay, yay, yay, nay, yay.
Yay. Yay.
Sorry, Jim.
Okay, Jim.
Going back to Peggy's concern, if a non-contributing building is allowed into the district, is voted into the district, there should be no differentiation between them getting incentives or not getting incentives. They should get the same as a contributing building would if they're inside the district.
And would you think then that all non-contributing buildings, that all buildings would be in a district? I mean, that you would just draw an area and that all would qualify?
I didn't say that.
No, that's what I'm asking. I just wanted to know.
No. I said earlier that I still think it needs to be an opt-in district, that you increase the incentives in order to get people to opt into the district. But if it's a non-contributing building, once they get into the district, they should not be denied the incentives.
Which is the question in D1.
Right, which we support and the board
Yeah.
supports.
It's okay.
Okay.
Good.
Council? So D1, does everyone support that? Okay, and then coming up with a non-consensual definition?
You asked if everybody supported it. I don't support the parking part.
Okay. And I actually,
Can I?
yeah, go ahead, Jim.
You know, Jerry, into the new downtown comp plan that we just adopted, they're going to come forth with a parking plan, I think they called it in that plan. And rather than trying to tackle what that's going to be in this ordinance, we need to look at the whole area down there and tackle it all at once instead of pulling out pieces of it.
I agree, absolutely. That's why when she asked, she said, do we all agree? That's what I'm saying. I don't agree with the parking part at this point, but I'm not willing, I don't want to discuss it right now, but you asked.
Yeah. Okay, I guess Glenn, I just kind of have a question on where you guys were thinking when you worked on D. Kind of give me your thought process on that. And I only ask because I want to clearly you and the board are in agreement on this. We're struggling a bit with it, so I'd kind of like to hear your
Right.
thought process.
Right. Well, I think we were really trying to identify different classes of properties within the district. And Peggy did raise the concern, well, can a non-contributor become a contributor? And yes, we've actually designated, not to go backwards, but in C, that there would be a process where HPB could do that. So what I think we'd really like to do is define what a non-contributor is, have HPB be the ones to decide what those properties are, and then there may be some buildings that could be demolished that are non-contributors and could not become contributors. That would free up, that would give some additional property rights, if you will, back to those properties that aren't significantly adding to the district. And then it just clarifies for staff what set of design guidelines do we apply to what buildings. And it provides a little bit more notice to those property owners what are the rules that I'm going to be evaluated from? So
What can they
I
expect?
think we can do it, and it would be not too onerous, and it would make a lot of sense for folks.
Okay, do you have clear direction? As clear as we can be tonight?
Yes.
All right, it's clear as mud. Okay,
Moving on.
Future districts, and the issues here are very similar to the opt-in district. These are other historic districts that may be created in the city. Right now, we have one, which is the Louthen District. So what staff and HPB is recommending, if we do create a new historic district, what our recommendation is, again, going back to that 66% number, we wouldn't necessarily have to have 100% consent of the property owners within that line, but the district has to make sense, and it has to meet criteria, and it has to be adopted by the HPB and ultimately the City Council. But again, we are proposing that we not get 100% consent to create that district for all the previous reasons we talked about.
And so on the Arapahoe Hills, they're going for national designation or?
Correct.
And so what happens to them in terms of us?
Ultimately, we'd want to create a district for Arapahoe Hills.
Well, I mean, if somebody gets a national designation, could we not just automatically?
I think it's an automatic. It wouldn't be an automatic process. You still have the local process.
No, but I'm saying, could we write that into code that it would become that? If they make it at the national level, why in the world would we say you're not good enough for us?
Well, I think that with the local designation, there are a lot of property restrictions. You have to go through the certificate of appropriateness. We look for maintaining the historic integrity of the district. But with the national register designation, there are no requirements identified with that. So it's just really a recognition of a place as having historic value.
Okay.
So it's really the local designation where people are impacted.
Okay.
And so I have a related issue
All right.
with that. So I did say this to Glenn casually before the meeting started. Pretty soon, most of Littleton's going to be over 40 years old. And there are quite a few developments, you know, one here, one there, whatever. You know, I want us to keep Littleton nice. I want us to recognize significant buildings. But my own head is having difficulty thinking that we would have maybe most of Littleton be in some kind of district. I mean, one district or another, potentially. And if we did, every district that we create gets a tax break, a property tax break. So potentially, we could reduce our property taxes in half. Because if we had theoretically almost everybody in the city in a district. So I'm just not, it seems to me I'd rather focus more on historic building designations than lots of districts. I mean, Louthen was, or Lothan, however one, I say Louthen, but that certainly was distinct. And some of the other areas, there are a few small areas like that. But I don't see a lot of Littleton like that.
Glenn?
I'm not sure how to answer the tax impacts of it. But I know you mentioned to me before, why not, if you can individually designate your home as a landmark, why create a district? Why not just have everybody individually designate their home? And one of the reasons is, and Arapahoe Hills is a good example, it was one of the first production builders. It was designed by
Yeah, I have no objection
local
to
Denver.
them. I have no objection.
But the district, the fact that they're all in, gives it significance, versus you may just have a bunch of pieces and ultimately piecemeal, over a 20-year period, they may all be designated landmarks. But I think you lose a bit, and you never know what that timing could be. And again, the same issues come up. I have a landmark right next to me. The guy has scraped the property and and has put up something, and you've kind of lost the context of the district, I guess, which gives it significance. You've kind of removed the intrinsic value that makes it something you'd want to designate and protect.
Peggy, if I may too, I think you have a valid point in we do not, there are, not just from a tax perspective, but in terms of redevelopment and vitality of the community, you do not, I don't think it's the intent of HPB nor the staff to say we want to draw the boundary around, we don't want to take the Georgetown approach and make the entire city a historic district, because we will wither at that point without the opportunity to do scrape-offs and remodels. I mean, that's a lot of what Glenn and I have been hearing from community members out as we're out there talking about. So I think your point is well taken in the context of where are these boundaries, and being very specific about council's approval and HPB's review of them as well, and that's obviously a policy decision for the council. So it's,
Well, I mean,
but this is setting the ground rules for those situations that you and Glenn are discussing, and you still have to have the process and the ordinance and the legal right to create those, even if there's one or two of them.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that staff and HPB believe that 66% number is, but Kirsten's also provided a couple of different, we looked at other cities, and they're everywhere from a majority of the property owners agreeing to 100%. So the HPB looked at all of them, and all those are options. We could certainly go 100% as well.
Bruce?
When we did the downtown, that was majority 51%.
Well, in the end, it was opt-in, so only those property owners who wanted to be in were in. So it's essentially 100%.
I guess I would recommend on the criteria to just, I think it's a good idea to look at other communities, because we're not the only older community. We're not the only place that's got houses that are heading to 40 years old. And we've also got houses that are older than that. So what do other places do? I think, there are neighborhoods that, like the Baker neighborhood in Denver. It's kind of the historic Baker neighborhood. It has, it's like tiered stuff. If the neighborhood gets this type of respect, and a block gets this type of respect, a 150-year-old mansion that, 6 presidents stayed in gets this type of respect. So it's different layers. Maybe if we're trying to solve problems we don't have yet, we kind of tighten up the criteria a bit, as opposed to being 40 years old.
Yeah.
Anybody, anything else on B? A? Claire?
Clear, 66% at this point.
Everybody good on 66% with that one?
No,
Great.
I'm not,
Peggy's
but
not.
anyway, so I'm not comfortable having 66%.
Do you want more?
I don't know what a number would be. It just seems to me that the way Littleton has grown over the years, whatever, that things kind of evolve, and our better focus is not to worry about this, but to try to keep all the neighborhoods thriving, so, and in good shape. So I'm just not if you have 66, if you have 75, whatever, then whoever doesn't sign is held captive. So, I mean, it's a non-consensual thing then, and I'm opposing non-consensual.
Let me ask the clarification then. This district, we had talked a lot about it being opt-in. You're not changing the rules on this district.
This would not be an opt-in district, no. No, Main Street's the only opt-in thing that we're,
So this district concept would be non-consensual then?
we're 33%.
Which is what happened with Loudon.
Well,
Well, did-
I'm agreeing with Peggy. I'm back to, I didn't understand that that's the term that we had just made. And again, I'm not comfortable with anything that wouldn't be opt-in.
So what was just said, that the 33% must participate? Is that where we're
They
at?
would be bound the same way.
Oh, I guess I didn't see that in there, and absolutely I don't agree. I would not agree with that. Yeah. But I don't read that as clear.
See, if we did something like designating an area by name, and then did what we were doing downtown, so we designate an area and then you opt in or not. But that's not what this is.
See, I think if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have the Louthon Street District, and you would never get a Arapahoe Hills District, or Arapahoe Acres, whatever they're called now. That would never become a district.
And I don't know the history on Louthon, whether or not everybody or most, or I don't know the percentage of support for that. It seems to me everybody who's there now loves it, but
It was 16 out of 17 property owners consented.
that's pretty significant.
But that's not a district with a whole street. If you don't have some kind of percentage in there that allows that 17th house to be part of that district. And as I recall, the reason why it wasn't was because it had been remodeled. And it had an addition on it,
So it
enclosed the
couldn't-
front porch or something that
So it-
made it look a little bit different from the rest of the houses on Louthon.
Okay, which is a different thing. So the person didn't oppose it, it didn't qualify,
Didn't want in.
but they already had the other features? But 16 out of 17 is a lot more than 66%. But anyway, I don't like the non-consensual forcing people.
I agree.
Yeah, I guess thank you, Peggy, for clarifying on that. I agree. Bruce?
I think Jim's right. I mean, if you don't set a level if you believe historic districts are valuable, there are, and especially in these neighborhoods, I think Arapahoe Hills, like you said, I mean, if you got 8 houses out of 20 or whatever it is, so what? I think you need, we've got the opt-in district in Main Street, which is fine. That was sort of the grand compromise at the time. I think everywhere else you see historic districts, you get some level of majority rule. I'm okay with some level of majority rule, and if you make it 80% or whatever the number is, 85. It sounds like you guys have 4 votes, the other way. But me personally, I don't have a problem with picking a number and saying if you get 80% of the residents in a given neighborhood want to do something, then everybody goes along.
I think historic districts are important, but I think property rights are even more important.
So if you're going to go with you can only have a residential district at 100% consent.
No, you'll never get one.
Are you going to gerrymander the district boundaries?
That potentially would be an option, right. So it wouldn't be as geographically obvious what the district is. It perhaps could be more of a circuitous line around the district.
I will tell you there's a house right next to the Arapahoe Acres that went to as close to 0 lot lines on their lot as they could go on all 4 sides. And that could have just as easily been inside the district as being on the boundaries of the district, of Arapahoe Hills. And that can happen in a residential district if you don't put some kind of criteria on that. And I understand about property rights, but on the other hand, if you're going to put a mansion, as we've got some in your district, right next to very small ranch-style houses, is that the way we want the community to develop?
Well, is that different, though, from the district issue? Isn't that a larger zoning issue?
I can't hear you, Peggy.
Isn't that a larger zoning issue than whether that would be a district or not? I mean, you can address that without dealing with a district.
Well, and also, I think if someone wants to build a mansion within the city ordinances, that is their prerogative. That is their property, and that is their money.
It
Good or
begins
bad.
to beg the question of, do you need or do you want residential historic districts? I mean, that's where, because I think the norm of the reason you have a historic district, and think about the Denver, what was that, 3 or 4 years ago, some of the lawsuits from neighbors within the historic district where they were creating them. I mean, the intent, I believe, of having a historic district is you have a geographic area that is locked in. It was built either in the same era or by the example you gave earlier, Glenn, about first mass production. Whatever it is, there's a unique characteristic about that neighborhood, and it is the desire of the community and through the council that you put additional restrictions on that to ensure that that is retained over time. Peggy's absolutely right. If this is about future development issues, then let's lose the debate around the historic preservation component, and let's ensure that our zoning meets the concern that Councilman Taylor raised about infill that is not compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. To me, that's a completely different conversation. And if you start to move into the opt-in in a residential component, you've probably lost the integrity and intent of what a historic district is. I'm being a little presumptuous in making that statement, but I think you do end up with a disconnect and you've lost the value of it for what that's worth. I don't know if that.
Very good. Yeah.
Bruce?
So what
It's almost as though that, I mean, if you wanted to change the 66% to 100%, but I think the criteria would have to be clearly defined that these types of houses, I mean, like Arapahoe Acres, it would have to be all those houses that met that same criteria and not create some kind of squiggly line around.
That's why you need the 66%. Because otherwise you can have holes in the donut if you go with 100%. Because they can create a district with individual houses on individual streets. There's only 4 streets in that whole development. They can go with individual houses on those streets that are say, no, I don't want to be a part of the historic district, and you've got holes in the donut then.
Or the council sets criteria by which the size or predetermines what those boundaries are and says if you are within those 4-block area, that could be a district if you meet whatever number you guys ultimately come up with, but you've predetermined where that geographic realm is, and it either is or it isn't. So
And you can do that under the 66% or any other rule. You can't do it under 100%.
I'm trying to throw out some alternatives between those two that still can get you at that same end result. And you may never get it if you set the boundaries as a council, because if you set the boundary and look for 100%, Councilman Beckman can be the veto vote. Picking on you.
philosophic, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
No, I'm just kind of agreeing with that.
Philosophically, I guess, I understand what you guys are saying about the whole property rights issue. I guess there's a couple different ways to look at that. Literally, if you've got, pick a high number, 90% of the people in a given neighborhood that has contiguity and that has consistent architectural attributes and so forth and so on. And this literally is what happened, I think, in Arapahoe Hills. What they were doing was, and it's not a district yet, but what they were concerned about was they had these particular style of properties, and people were starting to come in and scrape them. And what was there was going to be lost. And so the individual property right balanced off against the individual right of somebody to come in and scrape that house and put up whatever versus the majority of the homeowners in a given neighborhood who are trying to preserve their property value by extending protections around the neighborhood that if they don't have, will diminish their property. So, I mean, it sort of cuts both ways. I get both elements of the property value issue come into play there. I don't know what the right answer is. I think a high number over 66 is probably, you need some demonstration, but I would, personally, I think you will never get any of them. I think there are neighborhoods that probably should have the right to have that conversation with something less than 100% participation. Look at Aberdeen. I mean, Aberdeen's a pretty unique neighborhood. Never get 100% of everybody, but what good is it cherry picking houses in and around versus if the whole thing were to, and I'm not saying it should be, I'm just saying what if.
Well,
I could live with 90, 85, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't like 100 for just sort of the opposite reason Peggy was saying.
do we have to have a number? Could we have a process that people could come and ask? I mean, there could be a hearing without having that, and then you could hear what the people at the time, what they argued one way or the other, as opposed to locking it in now.
And let the council set the boundaries?
Or, I mean, if people brought a request with a proposal for whatever, then council could decide at that point. But I still, I mean, with me, I'm not real eager to do any imposing on a property owner, so. But I mean, if we look at Louthen, we got Crocker Street, that block right next to it. How come it isn't in a historic district? Seems to me it's pretty much the same. And I think one more street over, there's several in there all alike, but only Louthen that's the only one that has the designation for reasons that I don't know, so.
Yeah, and I guess I was my wheels were spinning similar. We could set the goal at 100%, but there may be special reasons why you want to reduce that down. And it could be there's 3 vacant property owners that are not located and aren't responding to the request. And you could get to the point where you're at 93%, and it's these folks that are not responding might give council a reason. We could look at other criteria why you might want to approve less than the 100%.
But those 3 property owners, it's their right to not respond. Just because they don't respond to what you want doesn't mean they should lose their rights.
Mm-hmm. Again, I guess I fall back on Bruce Stallman, is you have to look at the property rights as a whole in the district. And if you give all the rights to 3 property owners, they're taking away property rights from the remaining.
No, they're not. You're taking away everybody goes in with the same property rights. Now we're trying to say now that, a majority can now change your property rights. That is just very uncomfortable to me. I don't like it whatsoever.
And I think we have building codes and zoning, and we have a whole number of other more acceptable criteria out there that homeowners and property owners have shown a willingness to accept. That this is just on top of that, and I'm concerned about the tipping point issue. And I do know there are people who live in Littleton who choose not to live in covenant-controlled communities in Highlands Ranch. They made that choice. And I would imagine the majority of people in Littleton made the choice for that reason. I think they're very content with zoning and building codes, but I think there would be some concerns were we to place this kind of potential tyranny of the majority situation, which is what I consider.
Okay.
I don't think we swayed an opinion, so I think we're at 100%.
Kind of where we started.
Got it. All right. Moving on. It should get easier as we go along. So we've gone for the Main Street District.
That's exactly what we were looking for in terms of really supporting the discussion that you guys had, because it is a very strong issue around property rights and the regulation of government. So I'd give you guys kudos for really delving into this. And, obviously, if you sleep on this and have different thoughts or ideas, we are the code, and so we can amend as you so desire over time.
Okay, so we've talked about Main Street districts, we've talked about other districts, and now we're talking about individual landmarks. And again, the question is, would the city ever entertain the non-consensual designation of a landmark in the city of Littleton? That's really what, and I think I know what the answer is.
Really?
Go back to the 7:30 hour and
Should we take a poll? Should we poll votes?
If we could amend the questions as the conversation occurs.
Okay, moving on. Okay, the one thing I did want to point out is B1, that second sentence, I blew that. That should not occur in that paragraph. That should actually occur when we start talking about list of merit under that B1. So jumping to list of merit, as I mentioned, we have these levels of importance of properties from a historic standpoint. The list of merit is a list that HPB has put together. Those are the potentially historic properties, but they haven't come in and asked to analyze it, or they haven't gone through a survey study to actually designate them. Right now, our code says if you're on that list of merit, you do give up some rights. You mean when you come in to make an addition to that property or come in for a building permit, there's an automatic 30-day hold on that permit. And the idea is that gives staff a chance to sit down and counsel with that property owner, maybe have them make some changes to make it get closer to becoming potentially historic. So the real problem that I think staff and HPB agree on is everybody gets penalized under that. So if you do have a property owner that is putting a new roof on and we say you really should use these kind of shingles, they say, that's great, we'll do it. We're ready for our permit tomorrow. We still have to wait the 30 days. It's like we don't have discretion over that. So we definitely, both HPB and the staff agrees that that 30-day period ought to go away, with the understanding that we do have a computer permitting system. We'll know when those list of merit properties come in. We'll have a chance through the normal permitting process to talk to them about the advantages of being on the list of merit. So that's our B1 recommendation. There's some other options. One is that I think Kirsten's concern is we've created this list of merit properties, but there really hasn't been a public process of how you got on that. So we didn't really give a property owner a chance to say, I don't want to be on that list, or I do want to be on that list. So another option would be establish a public hearing process of if we do want to make it, we want to keep the 30-day period in place, but we have to go through a public process to make sure those properties are on board, or only list the properties with the owner's consent. So I think the HPB feels that that list of merit list is good, but perhaps it shouldn't have the restrictions that it does. So that's why we're saying take out the restriction of the 30-day period and keep the list of merit list that it is.
Comments? Bruce?
My sense of this one is, I don't know that I like either of the two answers that you guys came up with. I understand why. I mean, the getting rid of it is convenient from an administrative perspective, and it meets case law, and then it was overly burdensome to go out and contact everybody. To be honest with you, I think the city, on behalf of all the citizens, has a vested interest in identifying meritorious or list of merit structures. This isn't an oppressive burden to go 30 days, and frankly, the biggest issue isn't that when somebody agrees to make an alteration, they have to wait 30 days. It's they want to make a major alteration that would compromise the integrity of the historic structure, and the 30 days puts a time out on the whole thing so that people can reevaluate and see if there's a way to, essentially what ends up happening is HPB works with them to see if there's a way to meet their needs in a way that preserves the historic fabric of the building. Personally, I would be inclined to want to keep the 30 days, keep the list of merit, get HPB to work with people who want to make alterations, and if somebody wants to come in and really challenge it, which apparently happened on the IHOP, then, yeah, we can have that conversation. But the issue is giving enough breathing space into the process to allow people to figure out if there is a viable way to preserve historic structures while not impacting individual property rights, which we pretty clearly heard as a priority. I'd be inclined to leave it and let it, just leave it as is, even though it may not be overly consistent with case law. But, that's for the courts to decide.
So you don't have a problem with the 30-day?
I do not have a problem with the 30 days. I like the 30 days.
Well, I have a huge problem with the involuntary. I mean, you're in a house and somebody comes along and says, well, we think it should be designated on the list of merit for whatever criteria that group has determined. And then, that creates this 30-day hold on things, and it can create some other. So,
Well, and right now, we don't have any criteria to establish what gets listed. We were starting to work on a process, but, I'm not saying this happened by any stretch, but you could just say, that one's on the list, that one's on the list, because you feel like it. There's no criteria. So.
But it hasn't been applied egregiously. What
Well,
ends
we
up
don't-
happening is
we don't
HPB
know.
looks at them
Yeah.
and tries to ascertain in their judgment what structures have
That's right.
qualities on a historic, professional historic preservationist basis.
That's right, and we have qualified people looking at that, so you're right, it would never, I don't
It's not
think would-
arbitrary.
No, it's probably not arbitrary.
but it's not done with the property owner.
That's an additional issue, but if you ever had an appeal in district court, one thing to establish whether it's arbitrary is whether there were criteria that were applied, and in this case, we have no criteria to apply, A, and then the second issue is, one way around it, Mayor, would be to eliminate any non-consensual listing. That would cure the problem also. So that's another route to take. That makes sense?
Well, if we're saying we don't want to have a non-consensual landmark designation, and a list of merit is like, what, a building in waiting to become a landmark, right? Then it would seem to me you wouldn't have a non-consensual list of merit designation.
I agree with that from a legal perspective.
But if, the way I see the historical preservation, and I like it, is if we can't help somebody understand the value of historic preservation, then there's something wrong with us, or we're trying to do something that just we shouldn't be doing. We make the case. People want to, for example, go back to downtown historic district. People want to have businesses here now because, man, it's a draw, right? Having a house that's a landmark or on a working its way up a list of merit, if it is really meritorious, we ought to be able to help somebody see that. And if we can't, then they have the right to not keep it that way.
Bruce?
Yeah, but make sure you understand the ramifications. All the list of merit does is put a 30-day hold on a building permit to give people time to work that issue. If absent that 30-day hold, somebody can pull a building permit and pretty much do whatever they want to any structure. And so the implication is, yep, they certainly have the right to do that, but how do you get them educated on what their historic preservation alternatives are if there's no time with which to react? Because HPB meets, what, once a month? And unless staff really knows that a building is on quote-unquote list of merit, the building permit is done, the work is done, the historic fabric is lost. The 30 days is a minor hold, and I would argue to you that the community as a whole has a vested interest in maintaining some of the historic fabric that we could potentially lose absent the opportunity to work with people to do what you just described, help them appreciate the value of what it is they're dealing with.
I think there probably is another mechanism for us to be aware of buildings of interest like that and work with them.
Jerry?
There is a lot of history out there, and the bottom line is we can't keep the city as a living museum. There's certain properties we can identify as important historically, and that happens all the time. But not everything is a Shady Croft barn that needs to be saved. It just seems to be that if it's that important, maybe we should already know it. Maybe the emphasis should be in the Historic Preservation Board. Maybe we should find a way for them to be able to do more. I mean, if they meet once a month, and that is probably adequate for the most part, but maybe that we should be finding a way that they can have a team of people to help them do more research somehow. Because as it is today, they certainly can't do that, and it certainly is important. But if there is some property out there that does have a historic value to it, well, let's find out about it. Let's not hold up somebody who's trying to do a front porch or something because we all of a sudden have to go do some research, hopefully within 30 days.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the issue there ends up being resourcing. So Andrea's part-time, and I mean, she's basically the resource. So I think identifying more of these structures, figuring out how to communicate proactively with people is great. That's has been traditionally an expensive proposition. The list of merit and the 30-day timeout was an inexpensive proposition because it got triggered when somebody pulled a permit. And it was, relatively speaking, a relatively minimal impact on the property owner for what they intended to do. It did come into play, for example, on Arapahoe Hills, because they were talking about scraping some houses up there, and they were on list of merit, and so people were able to go time out, and then the issue got worse. So absolutely not trying to impair somebody's ability to do something, but it was a mechanical issue, and I agree, if we want to do more, allocate more resources to that effort, I have no problem with that. I'm in favor of it.
I understand the expense that would go with the city having to do something, but what we're saying right now, though, is that it isn't important enough for the city to make the historic board a little more active or whatever that would be. But it is okay for us to hold up a project where time is money and it's costing an individual money for holding up their property or their project, perhaps. But it's okay for them to be held up and cost money, but it isn't okay for the city. And I don't want the city to be spending lots of money unwisely either. But as we have this discussion, I'm thinking, well, maybe somehow we should work on the Historic Preservation Board to help them to somehow be
Let me encourage you, and I will continue to do this over the years, to think about it from a policy perspective. The administrative component, that's our job to figure out, right? So I think the question here is, a couple of questions, and what Councilman Stallman's put on the table is a level of risk that he's willing to take pursuant to the city attorney's comment, because we are putting people's properties on this list without criteria or their blessing, and then the 30-day hold to address the issues of those. And so, again, you've got two different issues to deal with. If the council's desire from a policy perspective is to say, just as an example, you want to reduce that legal risk by only putting on the list of merit those with an owner's consent, then it will be our responsibility to deal with the notification issues and get that consent. That takes care of the attorney's concerns. And then again, as a separate, potentially as a separate conversation, you have the question of now those that are on the consent, that have given us their consent, do you want to have that 30-day hold to address the councilman's concern about resolving what those issues are? And part of the notification could be, if you say yes, you're going to be subject to a 30-day hold on this permit or whatever the ultimate time is. So again, I think continuing to discuss, this question of liability or risk, if you will, related to we don't have criteria, or you can develop criteria. And then what do you want to do with those that, however they get on that list, how do you want to address them based upon Bruce's comment about resolving issues and not allowing the scrape-offs or getting HPB an opportunity, or at least staff even, to participate in that conversation. Because what staff, if you heard what Glenn originally proposed in this, was that we would still try to address Councilman Stallman's concern, but we would do it at the staff level and try to work with them at that point. But if it wasn't, I think you gave a re-roofing example,
right.
There was not a need to hold that up for 30 days, we could make that determination for it. So again, kind of pushing you guys back up, and is there a comfort with the level of risk that Bruce is suggesting? If yes, great, then we can try to address the workload issue or resolution of the 30 days.
If I can just make a comment, I'm wondering if there's not a way to combine these options into an option that would, number one, I think where we are getting, at least where I'm having an issue, and it combines the 30-day permit thing, is that these homeowners, somebody came in, well, they weren't looking, and designated their home, and that designation has put a disability on them. And the 30-day can be a disability, to have to wait because their contractor may have another job in 30 days or whatever the case, and it could cause a problem. If the HPB works with that property owner and lets them know that creates a different set of criteria, we're looking at you for a list of merit, and this is why, gets the buy-in from them. If the property owner says no, then I think we back away, and it can stay there till the property turns over, and then you can go see the new property owner. But if that property owner says, yeah, that's cool, I think that'd be great, and then they know, okay, if that happens though, and you pull a permit, you have a 30-day waiting period so that we can check. I mean, it's the surprise, it's the not knowing. It's my house. What do you mean you came in and you slapped a label on it, and now I've got this snag here? I think that it is valuable to have, there's properties out there that people may not realize how that value. The Sternberg building's an example of that. Unless you're the Sternberg architect aficionado, that was just a funky old building on the corner. But, so, I guess that would be my counsel. Does that kind of, to combine that, does that make sense? It seems like it would solve a couple of problems, Jim.
I'm not going to answer your question because I'm going to ask a different one.
Okay.
In another part of the code,
Muddy the waters.
yeah, I am. In another part of the code, don't we have if a building on the list of merit wants to be demolished, don't we have a waiting period with that?
It would be the same. They'd come in for a permit, and there's a 30-day wait. Yeah, and Kirsten was reminding me that some of the discussion with HPB was going back and basically asking all those owners on the list, yes or no. Potentially the concern was that list is going to shrink considerably. That was potentially the risk. Now, another item may be is if we simply say it's a maximum 30 days. Right now, the way I understand it, our hands are kind of tied that it's 30 days, even if we resolve and we get a good solution within 10 days. So that might be another middle ground.
Bruce?
At the policy level, proactively, yeah, the proactive side of it would be great, I guess, if we can figure out how to do that.
We can figure out how to do
All right. Then I guess it is pretty much incumbent, because if somebody doesn't want to do it for whatever reason, but at least you give them a shot. And traditionally, it hasn't been that way because we didn't have the resources, so it, as I described it is what it is, because, but if you guys can figure out how to do it, I would have no objections to going proactive on the whole thing.
You will rarely hear me say we can't do anything, and then the staff will beat me behind closed doors. But I don't think that should not be how you set policy. You should be setting and making policy decisions that you feel is appropriate for the community, and the challenge should be for us. So kind of a global statement, if you'll allow me.
Bruce?
On the city webpage on historic preservation, I didn't happen to go to it, but it says list of merit. Are these addresses on that list now?
There's a list. Yeah, there is a list.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you would have to go on. You would have to know that that is there.
Right.
To the mayor's point, and you would have to go and look and go, oh.
I agree with the mayor. I'm in support of the mayor's position.
Okay. Bruce?
I'm sorry. I'm asking Chuck Reed from the HPB. When you guys put somebody on list of merit, do you send them a letter?
Yes, that's the practice today. Moving forward, that's definitely our business.
So essentially, it was some level of communication that, congratulations, you're on list of merit.
Maybe we talk to Reed more of that.
It reads more as a congratulations, we'd like you to consider this designation.
So it was invitation.
Yeah.
Okay. So at least that direction, it wasn't just a mystery kind of, thing where it just happened, nobody knew about it, which is, I guess, good information. So.
Okay.
So the consensus is we go back to the property owners and get them yes or no? Would they be on the
Yeah,
list?
property owners are one of the first to know.
And then,
And I think we're okay with doing a maximum of 30 days as long as they also
Okay.
know that.
If they opt in, it's a maximum 30-day hold.
Everybody okay on that?
That's reasonable.
Got it.
Okay, Michael?
that was my question. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Oh, geez, appeals.
Okay. Final issue.
And I'm going to do a little quick preamble here, if I will, on the policy side. So I would ask, because one of the things we're going to be talking to you about as we work through the code is the appeals on pretty much all of your advisory committees. Planning Commission, I think, has some unique characteristics around it through the land use piece of it. But I'd ask that you think about this from a procedural level. Kind of, do you, as an example in here, feel like that an appeal of the Historic Preservation Board should come through the council, which created the code and made the decision for whatever the criteria that dictated or created the appeal, or do you want it to go to district court? Ultimately, of course, if you're denied at the council level, the appeal of the applicant from there would be to district court. So you'll end up there in any circumstance. But think about how you want the role of the city council to play in the appeal of advisory board recommendations or decisions, rather. I think in all of this, because not that this will set a precedent of the directive that you give us tonight, but we're going to be listening to the conversation and the discussion that you have as we bring forward other recommendations of your other advisory committees. So as much as you can, and we want to be consistent, I think, as much as possible.
Any comments? Bruce?
And I didn't mean to take away from Glenn.
Well, no, you described it, though. I don't know if I can add
We're on the
anything.
comments. Sorry, Glenn. No, go ahead, Glenn.
The only thing I would add is the HPB feels strongly that their decision should be appealed directly to district court. I think where staff is, it should ultimately go to council and then ultimately to district court. So there should be an appeal to the city council of a decision by HPB.
Can I, before we start asking questions, I'd just like to know why HPB feels that way and why you feel that differently.
I guess from an HPB standpoint, I'm not really sure where they ended up with it, but I guess if I was an HPB board member, it would give me, I guess, a little bit more ability to exact correct decisions. If somebody knew I had to make the HPB happy, or else I got a lawyer up and I'm going to district court, they may get a better response. That's, I'm guessing, probably part of the underlying thing. If somebody says, well, screw HPB, I'm going to go to council, then they won't be as effective.
We're not as intimidating as district court. We got to get tougher.
Maybe it's got some more to add.
Well, another reason was, I think, they are the experts in the matter and felt with the requirement that there's architects on the board that they had more of an expertise in the area.
And Steph, why do you disagree?
Well, I think ultimately it's the applicants are going to be citizens and homeowners and business owners of Littleton, and I think they kind of expect to be able to go to their city council and help resolve a problem with a board or commission. That's ultimately my feeling.
Okay, Bruce and then Jerry.
Is there anything inherent, it says something in here about district court in accordance with state law. Is there anything inherent, and I don't recall, with regard to HPB that would be different than, in a quasi-judicial sense? For example, does planning commission have to go to, if somebody wants to appeal a planning commission, do they go to district court or do they have to come to council?
It depends on what the issue is, and planning is unique, but with Board of Appeal or Board of Adjustment and licensing, those go straight to district court.
That's in our ordinance, correct?
That's in our current ordinance.
So that you have home rule, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have home rule authority to make the decision. Do you want it to route through the council, quasi-judicial, or in any of these? So the state does not dictate. You can jump.
Except for planning.
I'm sorry.
And planning with respect to,
There's a variety of different, in fact, that's for another discussion because Glenn has a chart on that, but planning's unique. Most of the boards, the way we have it set up now, they go straight to district court, and that is a home rule issue that we've done in our code.
and does that have anything to do with, beyond the code, does that have anything to do with just land use law?
Not for
Really?
this issue, not for HPB.
No, but with planning.
Planning, yes,
Okay, so HPB would be different in that regard.
that's right.
Okay.
Jerry.
So planning commission is quasi-judicial, but not the historic board. That's correct?
No, I think that, and speaking for our attorney, the state has identified through state statute some of the different requirements that are of statewide concern, and therefore we lose the home rule authority relative to how appeals of planning commission approvals get addressed. Everything else that you have, whether it's quasi-judicial or not, you have the authority to decide what the route is.
So you just answered my question as yes, I was right. Thanks.
You're welcome. I said it in 82 words.
I would prefer that it did indeed come to city council, because all due respect to the Historic Preservation Board, they are appointed, and city council members are elected, and it is up to us representing the city in the residents' side. I would prefer that it at least give the city an opportunity. While the Historic Board is certainly the experts, and we rely on them as far as advisory, but there's always that one time when it does come to you, when you really got to scratch your head and say, well, maybe we should reverse this decision or change it somehow. So I would prefer that it definitely ended up with city council first.
Okay. Jim?
Michael said earlier that we would be having a future discussion on changes to the code, and I would rather see us be consistent. If it's always going to come to council, or if it's always going to go to district court, that we make one decision or the other for every board and commission, that we don't cherry pick which ones we want to see and which ones we don't want to see. So I would rather this discussion not be part of this ordinance you're going to do, but going back to the code discussion that Michael talked about earlier, so that we're consistent with what we're going to be doing, rather than trying to address it today.
And we are prepared. Glenn actually has a spreadsheet showing all the boards and commissions and where they currently are, and so we can easily do that.
Does everybody concur on that?
Yes.
Okay. So we will table that. Bruce?
Yeah, but I think we need to acknowledge that the Historic Preservation Board is one of those boards where there's professionals specifically identified and appointed to it. That's one of the issues that the little task force is looking at, and it's significant on that board. There's a high degree of expertise.
That's true, but they're applying on the kinds of things that could get appealed, things that should be clearly spelled out, or as clearly as can be. But there's always little variation possible in interpreting. And so I don't necessarily see that we should do the same in terms of appeal process for all of them, but I do think I prefer for things to come to council as an appeal. This is just as you guys are working on what you're going to bring to us. I prefer things to come to us because I think it's less expensive for somebody to come to us, and we're supposed to be able to read and understand code, and so we become a double check, I guess, for interpreting code.
A question for Kirsten. If we say that council wants to hear these, can HPB, can they testify kind of to defend their position? Because it seems to me we had something where they could not testify.
That's a really good question to get out on the table. It was my recommendation at the time, and actually it was covered in the training that Tammy Tenoy put on, and that is if you are a quasi-judicial arbiter, you're sitting as a judge. So you give up that right, essentially, to testify, in my opinion, and it shouldn't happen. And I know HPB felt like they didn't have legal representation when the case got before council. Tammy's suggestion at the legal training, if you will recall, was maybe just having a different person handling HPB versus the person that's advising council. So just sending a different body to the HPB meeting for those quasi-judicial hearings is one way to lessen the impact, but that certainly is a concern.
So you're talking about a different attorney?
Well, that issue came up, I think, if you will recall, with Tammy Tenoy, because we talked specifically about the fact that HPB felt they needed legal representation at the hearing. That really can't happen. No one can argue HPB's position to you.
Right.
But just possibly having a new person come and advise council was one way to, I guess, lessen the idea that there's some sort of conflict between what they're being told at the quasi-judicial hearing versus what council's being told on the appeal. I don't know that it really solves the issue, but
It would seem to me that if you've got the person who's appealing and then you've got the board that they're appealing, and if council's going to hear it, we should hear from both.
that's not the way it's set up.
You would hear
Can we
presentations
change that?
from the staff. No, I think that's the legal issue of they've already acted as arbiter and judge at that point, and it becomes a de novo hearing.
When Merle's was up, though, the Historic Preservation Board did go to the Planning Commission as well as those that were on the other side.
I don't know if that happened.
It did happen.
Well, I believe you. I wasn't here, so I don't really know what happened at the time, I guess is what I'm saying. But no, it should not happen that way. That they're sitting as judges. They make their decision. It's just like the analogy to the court system. So the district court does all the evidentiary hearings and findings. They make their decision. The parties then have an opportunity to appeal to the higher court. The judges who are sitting in district court don't get to go to the appellate court and say, this is why we made our decision.
Okay. Bruce?
But then how do you ensure that all the evidence that was heard at the lower level makes it to council.
That's spot on, and it's so important for our quasi-judicial hearings that that evidence is getting into the record, that the criteria is there, and that in the case of historic preservation, that they're articulating why they made their findings. And you have the action minutes, and you also have a tape recording that you can look at, so it should all be in the record.
And you've got staff making the presentation in both circumstances.
Okay.
Because yes, I mean, when things have come to us, we have the minutes, and if we want to look at the video, seeing the minutes before the meeting, we can get more information that way. But having the minutes adequately lay out things is helpful. I mean, that's...
Okay. All right, so is there anything else on appeals?
No, ma'am.
Okay, is there any other business, Michael?
No. 9:30.
We're adjourned.